The wind on the Montana bench never truly stopped, it only paused, the way a man pauses to draw breath before saying a hard thing. On that raw autumn morning it came down off the high snowfields and moved across the brown grass in long shivering waves, worrying at the black skirts of the woman who stood alone at the head of the fresh grave. Della Hargrove did not bend against it. She stood broad-shouldered and still, a big, soft-faced woman in her late 30s, graying chestnut hair pinned beneath a faded blue kerchief, her chapped red hands folded over the worn handle of a spade. The earth at her feet was dark and mounded and wrong against the pale dead grass, and at its head stood a plank of split cedar with a name burned into it by her own hand the night before, when her eyes had been too swollen to see the letters, and she had cut them by feel, almost Hargrove. Below it, because there was no more room, and she had not trusted her voice to say the words aloud, she had burned the year alone. 1884. He had lasted just long enough to see the aspens turn. She had buried him herself, or near enough. Ned had helped with the digging, the hired boy 16 and freckled and gangly, his shovel clumsy and ground, already going hard with the season, and Ruth Palmer had come before dawn to wash the body and wrap it and hold Della's face between her two dry hands and say nothing at all, which was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 3 days. But the standing at the grave Della had wanted to do without help, these few minutes with the wind and the cedar plank and the long brown emptiness rolling away to the mountains before the men came. And the men came. She heard them before she saw them, the creak of good saddle leather and the blowing of well-fed horses, and she did not turn. They came up the wagon track in a loose knot, 5, 6, and arranged themselves in a rough half-circle behind her at a respectful distance, the distance a man keeps from a thing he has come to take. She knew most of them, Harlan Beck, who ran cattle along the creek, the two Dunmore brothers, who ran more, old Peavy from the Mercantile, there to lend the whole business the look of neighborliness. They said the words, men say. "Sorry for your loss, Mrs. He was a good man in his way." Della inclined her head a fraction to each, and said nothing, and waited. Because she had lived on this bench 11 years, and she was not such a fool as to believe 6 cattlemen rode 9 miles into the wind on a working morning to stand hat off over a sheepman they had scorned while he breathed. She was right to wait. When the murmuring of condolence had run dry, there was a clearing of throats and one horse stepping forward, and she knew without looking whose it would be. Silas Kroll did not dismount at first, which was its own kind of message, and when he swung down, it was with the unhurried ease of a man who has never been somewhere he was not welcome. He was tall and clean-shaven, dressed better than a working day required, a silver watch chain looped bright across his vest, and he was already wearing the small permanent smirk that lived at the corner of his mouth, as though he found the whole visible world a little beneath him. He looked at the grave for exactly as long as decency demanded, and not a moment longer, and then his pale eyes lifted past her, out across the long slope of the home pasture, over all that good grass curing sweet in the sun, and she watched him do it, and she understood everything. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, his voice smooth and carrying, pitched so the men behind him could hear and nod. "I won't insult you by pretending I come all this way just to say pretty things over poor Amos. You're a sensible woman. You always struck me as a sensible woman, which is more than I could ever say for your husband, God rest him." He let that sit, the little poison of it said kindly, so that to object would be to seem the unreasonable one. "So I'll talk to you plain, and you can think on it while you've got a clear head, before the hard part of the year sets its teeth in you." The wind lifted the corner of Della's kerchief and laid it down again. "You've got no man now," Silas went on, gentle as a preacher. "No sons. You've got a boy," a small nod toward Ned, who had come up quiet at the edge of things and stood white-knuckled with his hat crushed in both fists, "and a neighbor woman older than you are, and winter coming down off that mountain, the likes of which this country hasn't seen in a decade. And what have you got to meet it with? Amos's sheep." He said the word the way another man might say a disease. 200 head of the sorriest, scrubbiest wool you ever saw walk on 4 legs. Everybody in this county told your husband those animals weren't worth the grass they ate, that sheep would ruin this ground for cattle and ruin him besides. And look where telling didn't get him. His eyes flicked, deliberate, to the mounded earth. Now I'm not a hard man. I don't take pleasure watching a widow work herself to death in the snow over a flock that'll be froze stiff in a drift by February anyhow. So I'll do you a kindness nobody else in this county has got the heart or the money to do. He named his figure, low and clear, a sum for the sheep and the land together, the house Amos built and the well he dug, and 11 years of two people's lives. And it was so small, so openly an insult, that one of the Dunmore brothers looked down at his own boots. It was the price a man offers when he does not want to buy a thing so much as take it, and wants the taking to look like mercy. Silas turned his hat once in his hands and finished. You'd walk away with a little money in your pocket and your life in front of you, go back east to your people. Someplace warm, someplace a woman of yore. Here his eyes moved, just barely, over the breadth of her, and the pause was worse than any word he might have chosen. Your comfort could see out her years in peace, instead of dying up here in the wind for a dead man's foolishness. There he had said it. The men behind him were very quiet. Ned had gone rigid, and Della felt the boy's outrage coming off him like heat off a stove, felt him gathering breath to say something that would do no good, and she stopped him without turning, only lifting 2 fingers off the handle of the spade, and he subsided. Della said nothing. She looked at Silas Kroll a long moment, at his good coat and his silver chain and his patient, certain, waiting face, the face of a man who had never once doubted the world would eventually hand him whatever he set his eye upon. She looked at him the way you look at weather. Then she looked past him, out over the grass, but where his eyes had gone hungry she let hers go soft, taking in the whole long fold of the land she and Amos had chosen with their own hands. And she turned her broad back on the 6 mounted men and looked down at the cedar plank. "I thank you all for coming," she said at last, her voice low and even and roughened only a little at its bottom edge. "It's a cold ride back. Best not to keep your horses standing." That was all. She did not answer the offer. She did not refuse it, even, not in words he could carry away and repeat. And that unsettled Silas Kroll more than a plain no would have done, because a plain no is a thing a man like him knows how to wear down. Silence he did not know what to do with. He stood a moment longer than he meant to. Then he set his fine hat back on his head, touched the brim to her with a courtesy gone thin and cold, and said, "Think on it, Mrs. Winter don't wait on a woman's grief, and neither, I'm afraid, does the price." And he swung up onto his tall horse, and the knot of men reformed around him, and they went back down the wagon track, their voices lifting once they thought themselves out of hearing, one of them laughing at something, the sound thin and ugly on the wind. Ned stood beside her shaking, and Della put one chapped hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "Let them go, Ned. Let them laugh going downhill. We'll see who's laughing coming up." But she did not feel the certainty she put in the words. She felt very near to nothing at all, a great hollow flatness where the grief and the fear had worn each other smooth, and she stood until the riders were only a smudge of dust against the brown distance, and then she took up her spade, and she and the boy walked home. The home place lay a mile west along the bench, and the walk took them down through the near pasture where the flock was grazing, and it was there, among the sheep, that whatever had gone hollow in Della began, very slowly, to fill again with something harder. They were a sorry-looking lot. Silas had not been wrong about the look of them, and that was the cruelest part, that the insult had truth enough to sting. 200 head scattered across the slope in the raw light, gaunt and rough-coated, fleeces hanging in ragged dirt, clotted locks, nothing like the round white picture book sheep of the eastern farms Della half remembered from her girlhood. Scrub sheep, the get of whatever rams Amos had been able to beg or trade for, culls the big outfits wouldn't bother with. They lifted their narrow heads as she came down among them and watched her with their strange, sideways amber eyes, unafraid, for they knew her step, and a few drifted toward her out of habit, expecting the hand that brought salt. And there, working slowly along the fence line at the head of a little trailing string of them, was Bess. The old ewe was the worst-looking of the whole worst-looking flock if you went only by looks. Ancient in sheep years, her muzzle gone gray, one ear torn half away years back so that it flopped ragged when she turned her head, her fleece coarse and yellowed. But she moved through the others with a settled, unhurried authority, and where she went the flock's attention went with her, and when she lifted her head to test the wind, a dozen other heads came up to do the same. Amos had loved this old ewe past all sense. He used to sit on the top rail of an evening and talk to her. Actually, talk, while she chewed and regarded him with her clever half-tame eyes, and Della had teased him for it, and he had only smiled that slow-weathered smile and said, "You watch her, Della. She knows this country better than Kroll and all his cowhands put together. She'll take them to the low draws before the snow comes. There's more sense in that torn ear than in half the men in this county." She hadn't understood him then. She had thought it a sheepman's foolish fondness, the way a lonely, stubborn man will make a person out of an animal. Now she stood in the wind among his ragged flock, with the smell of turned grave earth still on her hands, and old Bess came slowly up along the fence and made a low burring sound in her throat, and looked past Della down the track where the riders had gone, and then back up at Della's face, as if to ask what all those horses had wanted. And Della Hargrove, who had not wept at the washing of the body, nor the digging of the grave, nor the burning of the name into the cedar, felt her throat close hard, and she went down on her heels so that she was on a level with the old ew's gray face, and put both her chapped hands into the coarse ragged wool of Bess's neck, and held on. Sell them. Sell the one thing he believed in, the one thing he had staked his good name, and his neighbors' laughter, and the last years of his life on, off for a pittance to the smooth, clean-shaven man who wanted only the grass under their feet, and let Silas Kroll run his fat cattle over Amos's grave and call it mercy. She heard the pause in his voice again, felt the little contemptuous drift of his eyes across the width of her, and something in Della that had been lying flat and hollow all that gray morning stood slowly up onto its feet. She knew things. That was the thing none of them knew about her, because she was a big, quiet woman who let her husband do the talking. She knew how to read a ewe's udder for the milk that would keep a late lamb alive, the smell of foot rot before it showed, the look of a sheep going wrong in the gut, which winter-killed grasses held their goodness under snow. She knew, from 11 hard years of watching and doing and saying little, 100 small, underrated things about keeping soft, weak animals alive in a hard country, and every one of them Silas Kroll and his laughing men reckoned worth exactly nothing, because they had never had to know them. She stayed a long while down in the grass with the old torn-eared ewe, until the light went flat and gray, and the wind picked up its voice again out of the north with a new, colder edge, the first true breath of the thing that was coming. At last Della pushed herself up, one hand on Bess's back, and stood looking out over the ragged flock and the browning grass and the far white shoulders of the mountains where winter was gathering, and she made no speech about it, even in her own head. She only knew, the way she knew weather, that she was not going to sell, whatever it cost her. She was going to keep the sheep, and bring them through, every scrawny, ragged head of them she could, and make the finest thing out of them this scornful country had ever seen, or die up here in the wind trying, the way Silas Kroll had all but promised she would. She took up the spade. "Come on, Ned, there's water to haul before dark, and I want to look at that old lame ew's foot while there's light." And she started up the slope with her steady rolling gait, and behind her, unbidden, the flock began to move, strung out along the fence with old Bess in the lead, following the big woman home as the first cold stars pricked out over the mountains and the wind came down off the snowfields to test the walls of everything she had left in the world. The wind that came down off the divide that first gray morning after the burying had teeth the calendar did not yet admit to, and Della felt every one as she stood at the top of the near pasture and counted the thing the whole valley called her fortune. 41 head. She had thought there were more. Amos, in the last months when the fever had him and the accounts had slid out of his hands, had spoken of the flock as if it were 60 strong, and she had let herself believe him because it was kinder to them both. But she walked the pasture with Bess trailing her and counted them one by one as they lifted their narrow heads from the frost-burnt grass, and the true number came to 41, and of the 41 there were not a dozen she would have called sound. She knew sheep. That was the thing the town did not know about her, the thing that lived under the soft face and the wide hips and the chapped hands they all read as belonging to a woman good for nothing but a warm kitchen and a soft heart. Her father had run a small tight flock on good Ohio ground when she was a girl, merino crossed careful with Cotswold for a long, lustrous staple, and she had learned at his elbow before she was 10 to read a sheep the way other children learned a primer, to put her hands into the wool and feel the grease and the crimp, to press a thumb along a spine and know in a heartbeat whether there was flesh there or only the memory of flesh, to pull down an eyelid and see the difference between a beast that would winter and a beast that would die. She had married Amos and come west and let the town believe what it wanted, because a woman learned early that being underestimated cost less than being envied. But she knew. And it was worse than the town supposed. She went down among them slow and began to do with her hands what she had not let herself do in the months of Amos's dying. She caught them one at a time and read their teeth for age, parted the fleece along the shoulder and dug her fingers to the skin, and what she found she filed away without letting it show. Bottle jaw on 3, the swelling under the chin that meant a belly full of worm. Feet gone soft and rank with rot in more than half. 2 ewes so thin along the backbone she could have laid a coin in the hollow of each vertebra. And the wool that was supposed to be the whole of the wealth was full of second cuts and break and dirt, half of it not worth the freight to ship. Well, she said to Bess, who had come to stand against her leg, half tame and entirely unimpressed. He didn't leave me much, but the truth of it, did he? But she was not a woman who could stand long in the middle of a hard truth without her hands beginning to reach for the mending of it, and so before the frost was off the grass she had begun to sort them in her mind, the sound from the failing, the breeders from the colors, the ones her care could carry and the ones no care on earth would carry through a Montana winter, that it would be a mercy and an arithmetic both to part with while they still had a little weight to sell. That was the first cruelty of the work, and she made herself face it. She could not save them all, and pretending she could was how a soft-hearted woman lost the whole flock instead of the third of it that was already lost. The fences told her the rest. She walked the line that afternoon with a hammer and a sack of staples, and every dozen rods found a place where the wire had gone slack or a post had heaved out with the frost, and she understood a flock could be sound as a new dollar and still be lost in a hard blow if there was no tight place to hold them against the wind. There was work here for 3 men, and she was one woman. When the light went, she lit the lamp and got down the ledger from the mercantile, because the money was the other half of the truth, and she had been putting it off the way you put off a tooth. It was worse than the sheep. Flour and salt and coffee, cartridges, the doctor's calls through the long dying, a note against the wagon, interest, and interest upon the interest, the whole of it come to a number that made her press the heels of her hands against her eyes until the lamp swam. There was hay owing, and the spring seed owing before it was even in the ground, and at the bottom, in a different ink, a line that told her Harmon Skelly had already been out, while Amos was still warm and had valued the flock against the account at a figure so insultingly low that she understood at once it was not a valuation at all, but an offer, and that behind it stood the man who wanted her grass. She did not have to guess who. Silas Kroll had already been to her porch on the day of the burying, turning his silver watch chain over in his fingers, telling her in his soft, reasonable voice that a woman alone couldn't be expected to nurse a pack of sick sheep through the kind of winter coming, that he'd take the whole scrub flock off her hands at a fair price, and the grass with it. He had said kindness the way Skeely had written valued, and it meant the same thing in both their mouths, and she had thanked him and shut the door, and understood that the winter she had to survive was not only made of weather. That night she did not sleep so much as lie in the dark and let the memory of Amos come. She saw him not as he was at the end, wasted and yellow, but as he had been the first winter they'd taken up this ground, kneeling in the lamplight in the lambing shed with his sleeves rolled and his gray beard full of chaff, working a chilled lamb between two fistfuls of gunny sacking until it kicked and cried, looking up at her with a grin split right across his weathered face. "Fine wool, Dell," he'd said. He was the only one ever called her Dell. You wait. These scrubs don't look like much, but there's blood in a few of these ewes worth building on. And a man who breeds for the fleece instead of the belly, who culls hard and feeds honest and holds them through, in 5 years he'll clip a wool off this place the Eastern men'll fight each other on the platform to buy. It don't take good luck. It takes a hard eye and a soft hand and the patience to do the same small right thing 1,000 days running. That's all fine wool ever was. That's all anything ever was. He'd said it, and then he'd got sick, and the doing of the 1,000 small right things had fallen away one at a time as his strength did, and the town had watched the flock go ragged and said, "There, we always knew that dreamy fool couldn't run sheep, and none of them had ever understood that it was not the dream that failed. It was only the man's body. The dream was sound." And she knew this was the thing that finally sat her up in the bed in the small hours. She knew she could do it. Not his way, which had always been more grin than grind. Her way. Her father's way. She was up before the light, with the notion set in her like a fence post tamped down, and the earth frozen hard around it, and the first of the 1,000 days she began with was the hiring of the boy. Ned Farrow was mucking a stall in Kroll's big red barn when she found him, and when he saw her he went the color of a brick and set the fork down like it had gone hot in his hands. He'd worked for Amos 2 summers and cried at the graveside where the men hadn't seen him, and when Kroll had needed a boy and dangled $1 more a month with Amos dying and no wages coming out of the Hargrove place, he'd gone, because a boy had to eat, and he'd been ashamed of it every day since, in the scalding way of a boy who is loyal by nature and has been made to act against it by need. "Ned," she said, "I've come to get you back, if you'll come. Ms. Hargrove." He couldn't look at her. "Mr. Kroll. He pays. I know what he pays. I can't match it. Not this year." She said it plain, because she'd decided on the walk over that she would never once let this boy hear her lie to him the way the men lied. "I can give you your keep and a bed warmer than that loft and $1 less than he does, and honest work that won't shame you, which is more than you've got in that man's barn, and you know it. And come spring, if we bring the clip in the way I mean to, there'll be money, and you'll have the first of it after the mercantile. That's the whole of my offer. It isn't much." The boy was quiet, working something behind his freckled face, and then he said, "Lo, he told me you'd sell. Mr. Kroll. He said you'd sell inside the month, and I'd be a fool to leave good wages for a place that wouldn't be there." He looked up at last. "Are you going to sell, Ms. Hargrove?" "No," she said. "I am going to bring them through." Something eased in the boy's shoulders that had been screwed tight there a long while, and he pulled his coat off the nail and put the fork against the wall. And that was the whole of the negotiation. They walked back over the frozen ruts together and did not speak of Kroll again, and behind them the big red barn stood full of fat cattle and easy money, and neither of them looked back at it. Ruth Palmer came over the next evening the way Ruth always came, without knocking, setting a covered dish on the table before she'd got her mittens off, her iron-gray braids frozen stiff as rope. She was wiry and old and sharp all the way through, and she had buried 2 husbands of her own, and outlasted them both and the drought besides, and she was the only living soul in the valley Della trusted with the whole of her heart. She sat down across the lamp and watched Della a while over the steam of the coffee, and then said what she'd walked a mile and a half in the dark to say. "They're betting on you, Della, down at the Mercantile. I want you to hear it from me plain and not have it come at you sideways from some man with a smirk." She wrapped her knobbed hands around the cup. "Skell's got a book going. Made no secret of it. They're laying money on how many head you lose by Christmas and how many by the thaw, and whether you'll have sold out to Kroll, or gone back east, or just gone under before the shearing. There's grown men in this valley who've put down cash that a fat widow can't keep a sick sheep alive through a Montana winter. Kroll's got half of them in his pocket and the other half laughing along so as not to be on the wrong side of him." Her sharp eyes did not soften. "I couldn't decide whether telling you would break your heart or stiffen your back. Looking at you, I believe I've decided right." And the old woman had it exactly. Della felt the thing land in her not as grief and not as shame, but as a kind of cold, clean fuel. Felt her back go straight and her jaw set. Felt every soft, doubting thing draw itself up hard behind her breastbone into something very nearly joy, if joy could be made all of iron. They wanted a fat widow who couldn't. She would give them a fat widow who did. She would take the whole winter, day by frozen day, and come to the shearing floor in the spring and lay a clip in front of the eastern buyer that would shut every mouth in the valley at once. "Ruth," she said, and reached across and put one chapped hand over the old woman's knobbed one. "You go on back down there tomorrow and find Harmon Skeel's book. And you put $1 of my money on the sheep." Ruth Palmer looked at her a long moment, and then the sharp old face cracked clean open in a grin, and outside the wind rattled the loose wire on the fence Della had not yet had time to mend, and inside the two women began to plan. The days went thin at both ends now, the sun coming up grudging and going down early, as if it too had decided the season was not worth the full effort. She went out into the yard with the gray coming up behind the mountains, because the light did not wait, and neither could the work. Some of the flock were not going to live through the cold, no matter what she did, and the kindest and hardest thing she could do was to know which, and not spend on them the feed and shelter the others needed. Almost had called it having a clear eye. She had watched him do it a dozen autumns, and had always found a reason to be busy at the far end of the yard. Now there was no far end to hide at. She brought the flock into the near pen in the flat gray light and went through them slow, with her hands, not just her eyes. Ned held the gate and watched, the boy's face pale and solemn. She did not send him away. He would need to learn it too, and there was no learning it at a distance. She ran her hands down the spines and felt the knobs of bone too near the surface, felt for the little cushion of flesh over the ribs that meant an animal had something in reserve to burn. She opened mouths and looked at teeth, because a ewe with her teeth worn to the gum could not graze hard ground in a hard year, no matter how willing her heart. She lifted feet and parted wool and looked at the skin beneath. "This one," she said, and Ned marked it with a smear of red rattle across the rump, and his throat worked, but he said nothing. An old ewe, her mouth gone, her frame a coat rack under the fleece, she would have starved slow and cost 3 others their portion doing it. And this, a ram lamb from the spring, something wrong deep in him, the eyes dull and the coat staring. This one, a ewe with a bag gone hard and ruined, who would drop a lamb in the spring she could not feed. 6, by the end of it. Bess came shouldering through the others while she worked, pushing her blunt head against Della's thigh as if to be counted, and Della put a hand on her without stopping. "Not you," she murmured. "Not you, you old fraud. You'll outlive us all." Bess's spine under her palm was a ridge of good hard bone with meat still banked along it, and her teeth were worn but sound. The matriarch. Della let her stand. The 6 were the ones the cattleman would have pointed to and said, "There, that is what the whole flock is, worthless, dead already, and too dumb to lie down." But it was not the whole flock. A flock was not one animal made 100 times. It was 100 animals, and some were finished, and some were only thin. And the whole art was in telling the one from the other with your hands in the cold and not flinching from either answer. She did the killing herself, out behind the lambing shed where the others could not see, quick and clean the way Amos had shown her, and afterward she was sick once, quietly, into the frost-stiff grass, and then washed her hands in the icy trough and went back to the living ones. The meat would not be wasted. Nothing on the place was wasted. But she carried the 6 of them in her the rest of that day like 6 small stones sewn into the hem of her, and thought that was right, that the day a person could mark an animal red and feel nothing was the day they had no business keeping any. The foot rot was next, and worse in its way because it was not mercy, only labor, filthy, back-breaking, endless. Half the flock was lame on the sour ground of a wet fall, and Amos, in his last years with his own bad leg, had let it go. She built a stand out of an old hurdle and a length of rope so she could tip a ewe up onto her broad rump and hold her braced against her own thighs, indignant and stiff-legged, and, once past the first struggle, oddly resigned. She took the knife and pared away the overgrown horn, curl by curl, down to the black, wet, stinking pocket of rot in the cleft of the hoof, and cut it clean. Cut till she saw pink, cut till the animal flinched, because the rot lived where the air could not reach, and the only cure was to open it to the light. Then the blue vitriol, the copper sulfate in the bucket, each paired ewe stood in it to the fetlock and turned out onto the dry ground of the far pen. Her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles. The cold split them, and the wet kept them from healing, and the rattle and vitriol stained them, so that by week's end her hands were the hands of something dug up, red, blue, black at the creases, swollen at the joints. Ruth came by on the second day and watched a while, which for Ruth was its own kind of speech. "You'll ruin those hands," Ruth said at last. "They were never much to look at." "That's not what I said." Ruth came through the gate uninvited and rolled her sleeves. "Give me the bucket end." "My mother kept sheep in the old country when your mother was in diapers." And she took the bucket end, and did not leave till dark, and did not once say the thing everyone else said, which was that Della ought to sell. Ruth had buried a husband too. Ruth knew there were times a woman held on to a thing, not because it was sensible, but because letting go of it was the same as agreeing that everything they said about you was true. The worming she did with a drench Amos had kept the receipt for in the back of the tally book, a bitter brown mixture and a horn to pour it down the throat with, tilting each head back and stroking the throat to make them swallow, ewe after ewe, until her arm ached. But the worm was what hollowed a sheep from the inside while the grass got thin. What turned a thin animal into a dead one over a hard winter, and she would not lose them to a thing she could pour out of a bottle. So she drenched them all, and marked each on the shoulder with a stripe of blue as she let it go, and by the end the whole near flock wore her blue stripe like a company under one flag. And she fed them. That was the quiet heart of it. The thing none of the men would have credited, she began to feed and to sort. Amos had run them all as one mob, the strong shouldering the weak off the good hay, so the weak went into winter thin and died, and that was the way that had made the flock look, to a passing eye, like exactly the folly the town called it. Della broke them up, built her hurdles into 3 pens, and sorted the flock by condition. The carrying ewes, the young things still growing, the sound and strong that could fend for themselves, and fed each according to what it needed and not according to what it could fight its way to. And she watched. Over the days, the thin ones begin, very slowly, to fill. It was Doc Vance who caught her at it. She looked up from the drench horn to find the old veterinarian at the fence, stooped and spectacled, his kind, tired face tilted as he watched her tip a ewe's head back and stroke the drench down. He had come to see a neighbor's foundered horse and swung wide to look in on the widow Hargrove, because a man had said in town, with a laugh, that she was out there physicking dead sheep, and Doc Vance had not liked the laugh. He stood at the fence a good while, and the laugh, whatever he had half expected to find, did not come. "That's a proper drench," he said instead, surprised, coming through the gate. Most folk pour it in too fast and drown half of them. Who taught you the throat stroke? Amos, and my own 2 eyes. The last 20 years. He crouched and took up the foot of a ewe she had pared that morning and turned it to the light and grunted. That's better paring than I get from men who've done it their whole lives. You cut to the quick and weren't afraid to make her bleed. The rot lives where you're afraid to cut. Something changed in the old man's face then. Some door standing politely, half shut, swinging open. He had come out of a vague kindness, to spare a foolish woman the worst of her foolishness. He stayed the rest of the afternoon because he had found, to his plain astonishment, a colleague. He showed her how to sling the vitriol up with a little slaked lime so it stuck to the hoof and did its work longer. He showed her how to read a lower eyelid for the pale that meant the worm was winning even in an animal that looked sound. Membrane's your gauge, he said. Pink is fighting. White is dying. And this gray pink here, this one's tired, but she'll come round on the feed you're giving. You're right to spend it on her. He would not take money. He took a jar of her chokecherry preserve and the promise she would send Ned for him if the cold brought scours or bloat, and he climbed back into his buggy and looked down at the cracked red-blue-black ruin of her hands. They told me you were too soft for it, he said. They were looking at the wrong part of you. Grease those hands at night or you'll split a knuckle to the bone and lose it to the cold. Mutton tallow. You've plenty of that now, I expect. And he was gone into the dusk, and Della stood in the yard with the wind carrying the first true edge of winter, and found she was, absurdly, near to crying, not from the hardness of anything, but because a person who knew the work had looked at her doing it and had not laughed. The first hard frost came 4 nights later, without much warning, a still iron evening, the sky gone deep aching green at the western rim, the puddles skinning over by full dark, the grass by midnight furred white. Della was up before it was light, because a sound had reached her through the wall that was not the wind, a sound she had learned in 20 autumns to hear even asleep. A ewe in trouble, that low, laboring, wrong note under the ordinary noise of a flock. She found Bess at the pen rail in the gray, agitated, stamping, and Bess turned and went a few steps toward the low ground by the creek and stopped and looked back, plain as speaking. And Della did not stop to think, but caught up the lantern and went. The creek margin was a bog even in a dry fall, and the frost had put a treacherous skin over the black mud that would bear a fox and not a sheep. And one of the young carrying ewes, one of her best, had gone down through it in the night and mired herself to the belly and struggled until the struggle drove her deeper, and now lay half on her side in the freezing muck, 2 spent even to bawl. Only that low, laboring note going out of her with each breath, the note Bess had carried to the house. Another hour, and the cold would have her. Della set the lantern on a tussock and went in. The mud closed over her boots and up her shins, black and shocking, so cold it read at first as a burn, and she waded to the ewe and got her arms down under the mired body and heaved, and nothing came but a sucking, and the mud only gripped the harder. She was a big woman, and glad of it then, glad of every ounce the town had used to name her soft. She braced her broad back and did not haul straight up, which was what the mud wanted, but rocked the animal side to side, patient, working air down into the seal of the muck the way you work a fence post loose, and the ewe, God help her, had the sense to go still, and let her. Twice Della's feet slid, and she went to one knee in the ice water and came up, gasping, and twice she set herself again. She heard, distantly, the boy running, roused by the lantern gone from the house, his voice cracking on her name across the frost. Della. Ms. Hargrove. The plank. Off the shed. Bring the plank and the rope. Don't come in past the willow, because if he came in too, he'd mire beside her, and then there'd be 2. And she'd not lose the boy to save a ewe. He came with the plank, gangling and white-faced and steadier than his years, and laid it flat on the frost-skin so it spread his weight, and Della got the rope round the ewe's chest behind the forelegs, with her numb hands fumbling the knot 3 times before it held. And then it was the 2 of them, the boy hauling from the plank, and the woman below with her shoulder set under the animal's haunch, rocking and lifting, until with a great obscene sucking groan the mud let the ewe go all at once, and they came up the bank together in a tangle, the woman and the sheep and the boy, all three black to the waist and steaming in the lantern light and alive. The ewe could not stand. Della did not waste a breath being glad. She stripped off her own sodden shawl and coat and rubbed the animal down against the deep-killing shiver that had set in, and got her up across her shoulders. 140 pounds of wet ewe, and Della carried her, staggering, up the frozen slope to the shed, where a dry bed of straw and a rug thrown over could argue the cold back out of her. She sat in the straw in her wet shift with her arms around the animal's neck and her own teeth going like the ewe's, and held her and rubbed her and talked to her low, the way she'd talked to Amos at the last. And somewhere in the black hour before dawn the shivering changed from the killing kind to the living kind, and the ewe heaved herself up onto her own legs and stood, spraddled and trembling and alive, and put her nose into the hay. Bess had stood the whole while at the shed door like a sentry, and when the ewe stood, the old lead ewe made a low sound in her chest, and turned and went back to the flock, her work done, and Della laughed out loud in the cold, a cracked, exhausted sound, because she had been out-generaled and out-hearted by a sheep, and did not mind it in the least. She had beaten the frost. She sat in the doorway as the gray came up at last, wrapped in a horse blanket, her hands wrecked and her body one long ache, and watched the light come up over the flock she had culled and pared and drenched and sorted and dragged out of the mud one at a time, and thought, for the first time since they'd put Amos in the ground, that perhaps she could do this. Perhaps the thing they all knew to be impossible was only hard, and hard was a different word entirely, and hard she had never once been afraid of. It was 2 mornings later that she came up to the near pen with the oats and found the gate standing wide, not blown. She knew the difference at a glance. The wind did not lift a drop latch and swing a hurdle gate back on its hinge and leave it tidy against the rail. Someone's hand had done that. The near pen where she'd sorted the carrying ewes, the ones she'd spent her best hay and her scarce oats on, the ones with the spring lambs in their bellies that were the whole of her wager against the winter. The near pen stood empty, the frost churned with the print of scattering hooves going every way toward the open range and the timber and the cold, and out past the fence line, small in the early light, 2 riders sat their horses on the rise, watching, in no hurry at all, before they turned and walked their mounts easy over the hill toward Kroll's grass, and one of them, before he dropped from sight, lifted a hand to the brim of his hat, to her, across the frozen distance, slow, so she would be sure to see it, so she would know it was no accident. She did not scream, and she did not weep. She stood a moment with the oats in the bucket and let the fury of it burn through her clean, and then she set the bucket down and called for Ned and for Bess. And they went out into the cold to gather the scattered flock before the timber and the coyotes and the coming night could do what Kroll had paid 2 men to do. It took them the whole short day and most of a lantern-lit night, and old Bess did the work of 3 riders, ranging out along the draws with her torn ear cocked, gathering the frightened bunches and turning them home the way she had 10,000 times. And by the gray of the next morning they had all but 4 back behind a gate Della had wired shut past any hand's easy opening. The 4 they never found, and Della grieved them and did not let it stop her, because stopping was the one thing Kroll had bought and she would not give it to him for free. The wind came down off the high country a week before the calendar said it should, and it came like something with a grudge. Della felt it first in the seam of the cabin door, a thin whistling knife of cold that hadn't been there the night before. Out past the yard the grass had gone the color of old rope, and the sky over the northern ridges had that low, bruised, waiting look she had learned to read from Amos. He used to stand in the doorway just so, coffee going cold in his fist, and say nothing a long while, and then say, "Weather's turning, girl," in a voice that meant they had work to do. She said it now herself, quietly, to no one but the cat and the fire. "Weather's turning." And then she reached for her coat. There was no more time for grief the way there had been in the first raw weeks. Grief was a luxury now, like sugar, like sleep. What she had instead was a scrub flock of 40-odd sheep with their ribs still showing. A hired boy who ate like a threshing crew and worked like two men. And a winter coming on that everyone promised would break her back and her heart, both, before the thaw. She did not know how long she had to make ready. But she knew it was not long enough, and so she moved. The shed was the first thing. Amos had always meant to build a proper windbreak on the north side of the fold, banked against the rise where the flock could crowd out of the worst of the weather, and he had always meant to do it next year, the way men mean things, and now next year had run out on him. What stood there was a half-rotted lean-to that wouldn't turn a stiff breeze. Della stood looking at it with Ned beside her, the boy's freckled face pinched with cold and doubt, and said, "We'll have to build it ourselves then, you and me." Ned looked at the sagging poles, and at the sky, and at her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that's a deal of work for," and then he stopped himself, because he was 16 and loyal and had already learned that certain sentences did not end well in the widow's hearing. For a soft old woman, she finished for him, not unkindly, and something in her face that might almost have been a smile. "Go on. Say it. Then fetch the crowbar, because the soft old woman's going to need you on the other end of it." They worked 6 days on that shed, and it was the hardest 6 days Della had known since the fever winter that took her mother. She had no lumber to spare and no money to buy any, so they took the shelter apart pole by pole and rebuilt it out of what the land gave them. Deadfall dragged down from the creek timber behind the plow horse, old fence rails, the gray weathered planks off the collapsed corn crib. She dug the post holes herself where the ground hadn't yet frozen iron hard, leaning her whole broad weight onto the bar, her chapped hands splitting open along the old cracks until she wrapped them in rag and kept digging. Ned notched the joints under her direction, and she taught him the trick of it the way Amos had taught her. The shoulder of the notch cut just so the weight of the roof pole pressed the joint tighter instead of shaking it loose. "Where'd you learn that?" the boy asked once, and she said, "From a man everybody called a fool," and did not elaborate. They banked the north wall with sod cut in heavy black bricks stacked 2 deep, and laid the roof poles close, and thatched them thick with slough grass, and shoveled dirt over the whole of it until the shed hunkered into the rise like something grown there rather than built. When it was done and the light was failing on the 6th evening, Della walked the inside of it slowly, and felt the stillness of the air against her face. No wind, not a breath, though outside the cold was moving through the yard like a river. She stood in that pocket of held warmth, and something eased in her chest that had been clenched a long time. "It will hold," she said. "It'll hold, ma'am," Ned agreed, and there was a new thing in his voice, a kind of surprised respect he was too young yet to hide. The feed was harder than the shed, because the shed only wanted labor and the feed wanted money, and money was the one thing Silas Kroll had made certain she would not have. She learned that the Tuesday she drove the wagon into town with a crate of eggs and a list, and stood at the counter of Hollister's Mercantile while the storekeeper would not quite meet her eye. Her credit, he said, studying the grain of the counter as though he'd find better words in it, was, well, times being what they were. Accounts being tightened all around. He was sure she understood. "I've held an account here 11 years, Della said, her voice level. "Amos and I never once left a debt past the fall." "I know it, Mrs. Hargrove. I do know it." And here Hollister looked up at last, and there was misery in his face, and something else that told her the whole of it. It's only, a man's got to think of his own accounts. And Mr. Kroll, he does a considerable trade here, and he happened to mention he didn't finish. He didn't have to. She could see Kroll's silver watch chain in the man's stricken eyes, as plain as if the cattleman were standing there, smirking, having a quiet word about which of his neighbors it was prudent to carry, and which it was not. Della set the crate of eggs on the counter, her hand steady. "I'll not ask you to cross a man you depend on," Take the eggs against what I already owe, and we'll call the account closed. I'll trouble you no further." And she walked out with her spine straight and her chin level, and did not let herself feel the sting of it until she was 3 miles down the road with the town well out of sight, and even then she only let a little of it out, because there was no time for more. So she went around the mercantile the way water goes around a stone. If the store would not carry her, the valley would, one family at a time, in the old way that had kept people alive on that ground long before there was a store to run an account at. She had a strong back and a knowing pair of hands and 40 years of skills the town had never thought to price, and now she spent them. She doctored the Petersons' milk cow, gone dry and sour with a twist of the gut, and had it giving sweet again inside the week, and took her pay in 3 loads of Timothy hay. She and Ned dug old Widow Bauman's potatoes and cabbages against the frost, and drove home with turnips and a barrel of cull potatoes. She sat up 2 nights with the Larson girl through a croup until the barking cough gentled and broke, and Mrs. Larson pressed on her a full sack of oats and a side of bacon, and would not hear a word against it. Eggs went out from the Hargrove place in every direction that fall, and slowly the hay went up in the new shed's lee in a stack that grew taller than the boy, and the grain bins filled, and the flock's winter store crept towards something that might, if the season showed any mercy at all, be enough. It would be close. But close was a great deal more than the town had wagered she'd manage, and there were evenings, driving the empty wagon home under a sky already pricked with hard early stars, when Della let herself feel, just for a mile or two, something almost like pride. The flock repaid her in small coin, and she learned to be glad of it. Their coats were coming in, that was the thing she watched for above all. The deep, even thickening of the fleece the way it should on an animal warm enough and fed enough to grow it. In September they had been ragged, gap-coated things any wool man would have marked down for scrub, and worse. Now, standing among them in the frost-white mornings, with her fingers buried to the second knuckle in the grease and warmth of Bess's shoulder, Della could feel the change under her hand like money in a purse. The old ewe suffered the handling with her canny yellow eye half shut, and Della murmured to her the foolish, soft nothings she'd never have said in front of Ruth. There now, old girl, you're coming along fine." And then, in the last week before the snow came for good, one of the young ewes dropped a lamb. It was out of all season, and it should not have lived. Della found it at first light, a wet dark scrap in the frozen straw, already going still, the ewe standing over it confused and bawling, her instinct spent. The cold had it. Another hour, and it would have been a stiff, small nothing to carry to the midden. Della knew the sensible thing, knew what Kroll or any of the cattlemen would have said. Let it go, it's nothing. A scrub lamb from a scrub flock out of season, save your strength for what's worth saving. She scooped it up against her chest instead and carried it running, her rolling gait broken into an ungainly heavy trot across the yard, and brought it into the cabin and laid it down on the open oven door. She worked over that lamb the whole of the morning. She rubbed it dry and rough with sacking to bring the blood up under the skin, warmed milk and dribbled it a drop at a time past the slack cold lips, and when it would not swallow she breathed into its mouth the way she'd breathed steam into the Larson child, willing the small ribs to lift. Ned kept the fire and heated stones to pack round the little body, and for a long gray while there was nothing, no flicker, just the widow bent over a dying scrap with her chapped hands moving, and her voice going low and steady, "Come on now, come on." The lamb kicked. A weak spasm of one hind leg, then a shudder that ran the length of it, and then, miraculously, absurdly, a thin wavering bleat, no louder than a kitten. That filled the little cabin like a bell. Ned made a sound that was half a laugh and half something wetter, and Della sat back on her heels and let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for a season, and something broke open in her that grief had sealed shut. She laughed. She hadn't laughed since before Amos died, and it came out rusty and startled, and then the tears came right behind it, hot and unashamed, and she let them, kneeling there on her own kitchen floor with a live lamb bawling on the oven door and the freckled boy grinning at her through his own wet eyes. "Well," she said, when she could speak, wiping her face with the back of a filthy hand. "There's one they said I couldn't keep." She carried him in a wool-lined crate by the fire for 3 days until he was strong enough to go back to a bottle in the shed. But she thought of him afterward as a kind of ledger entry against everything the town had said, one small warm sum on the right side of a page they'd all written off, and on the long freezing nights that followed she held onto him in her mind the way a body holds a coal. Because the nights were the hard part. She had steeled herself for the labor and the cold and the money, but not for the silence of a cabin after the boy had gone home and the fire had burned low and there was no voice in the dark saying "weather's turning, girl," or "well done," or anything at all. The work filled the days so full there was no room to feel anything. But the nights emptied out, and into that emptiness came every doubt she'd shoved aside since morning. And they came in Kroll's voice, and Hollister's, and the voices of half the valley, too soft to keep them. She'll be broke or begging by the thaw. She'll sell to Kroll by Christmas and be glad of the price. She would lie awake and hear the wind hunting round the eaves and those voices under it, and ask herself, in the honest dark, whether they were right, whether Amos had been a fool after all, and she a fool for loving him, and this whole desperate winter's labor only the long, slow way of learning what the town already knew. On the worst of those nights she got up and lit the lamp and walked out to the shed in her husband's old coat with the wind trying to tear the door from her hand, and stood inside the tight, warm dark and listened to the flock breathing, the soft shuffle and stir of 40-odd bodies pressed close and content out of the weather, alive and warm because of what her 2 hands had built, and it steadied her more than any words could have. They were still here. So was she. It was, some nights, the only argument she had against the dark, and it was enough to get her back to bed. Ruth came when she could, which was not as often as either of them wanted, but the wiry old woman turned up one bitter afternoon with her iron-gray braids frozen stiff and a jar of elderberry cordial under her arm, and she took one long look around the yard, at the banked shed hunkered into the rise, at the high stack of traded hay, at the flock standing thick-coated and calm where by rights they ought to have been dying, and said nothing for a moment. Then she snorted, which from Ruth was the highest kind of praise. "Huh, they're saying in town you'd be broke by now. I know what they're saying. They're saying it different than they were." Ruth stamped the snow off her boots. Bit put out about it. Some of 'em. Kroll most of all, though he's too smooth to let it show. A man makes a bet on a widow folding, and she don't fold, it sits wrong with him. She fixed Della with her bright hard eye. "You look like death warmed twice over. When'd you last sleep a whole night?" "Can't recall," Della admitted, and was surprised into something like a smile. "No, I don't expect you can." The old woman's voice gentled, just a fraction. "But you're standing, Della Hargrove. That's the thing of it. Half of 'em wrote you into the ground back in September, and here it's near December, and you're standing. And that flock's fatter than my brother-in-law's, God rot his lazy hide." She thrust the cordial into Della's hands. "Drink some of that of a night. Won't fix your troubles, but it'll warm you to face 'em. And come spring, when you've wool to sell—" She stopped, and something passed over her weathered face, some flicker of a hope she wouldn't quite say aloud. "Well, we'll see what the town's saying then, won't we?" And the truth was the town was beginning to say something already, in the grudging sidelong way of people who have made a judgment and don't care to be caught reconsidering it. They'd heard about the shed the widow and the boy had thrown up out of deadfall and sod. They'd heard she doctored the Peterson cow and broke the Larson child's croup and buried Widow Bowman's roots. They'd heard, and this stuck in the craw hardest, that she'd brought a dead lamb back to life on her oven door, the kind of story that grew in the telling and would be a full resurrection by Christmas. And they looked, passing the Hargrove place, at the smoke standing straight up and the fat calm flock in the lee of that snug shed, and they did not say, she was doing well, because that would have cost them too much to admit. But they said to each other that she was still there, that she hadn't broke yet, and the first real snow of the winter not even fallen, the whole long, murderous heart of the season still ahead, waiting up in the bruised northern sky to see what she was truly made of. The wind came first, not as a gust, but as a long rising note that seemed to draw itself up out of the north like something taking a breath before it screamed. Della heard it in the small hours, lying awake in the cold bed she had not learned to fill with only her own warmth, and she knew the sound of it the way a body knows the tread of an enemy on the stair. She had heard that note the winter Amos lost the 2 rams in the coulee, and the year the Petersons froze in their wagon not 4 miles off. This was not the ordinary Montana wind, which had 100 voices and meant nothing by any of them. This wind had one voice, and it meant the season had come to collect. She was up and dressed before the first gray stain touched the window glass, moving through the dark house by the map of her own hands. When she lit the lamp, the flame stood straight and trembling, and beyond the cold panes the world had already begun to erase itself. Snow was not falling so much as flying, moving sideways in long ropes and sheets, and the near fence posts had gone the color of nothing at all. She let herself be afraid, once, thoroughly, so that the fear would be spent and out of the way. Then she wrapped bread and cold meat in a cloth, banked the stove high, pulled Almos's old buffalo coat down off its peg, and went out into it. The cold took her breath the instant the door came open, and the wind hit her broad body like a shoulder and staggered her sideways into the jam. She got the door shut by leaning her whole weight against it, and then she was alone in the white roar with the rope she had strung between house and barn in October, back when the town was still telling her she was too soft to last the winter. She had laughed a little, tying that rope, thinking of Almos, who had strung one every fall of their marriage and never once needed it. She did not laugh now. She took the frozen line in both mittened fists and went hand over hand into the blindness, the drifts already past her knees where the yard dipped, the barn no more than a darker smudge of nothing until it was suddenly close enough to strike her forehead. Inside, the animal warmth met her like a wall, close and rank and living. The sheep had crowded to the deep end of the long shed, packed so tight that they moved as a single gray creature breathing, and in their midst old Bess stood with her torn ear cocked and her yellow eyes fixed on the door as though she had been waiting for exactly this, for someone to tell the rest of them what would be asked. Della went to her first, always to Bess first, and laid a hand on the coarse crown of the old ewe's head, and something in the flock eased by a degree that she felt more than saw. Ned came through the drifts an hour behind her, near frozen, having roped his own way from the bunk lean to the same as she had, and she near wept at the freckled sight of him, though she only said his name and put him to work. There was water to keep from icing and hay to break out of the stack, and the 2 of them fell into the grim arithmetic of it. The labor that only holds the line another hour and then asks for the hour after that. Twice Della had to stop and hold her hands inside the buffalo coat until the feeling came back in a slow scald of pins, and each time she made her face say nothing was wrong, so Ned's own face would learn to do the same. The day never truly lightened. The whiteness outside turned a paler shade of murder for a few hours, and then began to darken again toward a night that would be worse. They ate standing, the bread half frozen, and Della portioned the hay by feel, giving old Bess her share by hand because the others watched Bess and took their calm from her. Now and again the wind found some new seam in the boards and drove a fan of fine snow across the floor, and each time Della or Ned would find the gap and stuff it with a twist of sacking and go on. Ruth Palmer came at dusk, which no sane person should have done, and Della's heart near stopped when the barn door heaved inward against the drift, and a figure white from crown to boot fell through it and could not stand. It was the iron-gray braid, stiff with ice, that named her before her face did. She had followed her own fence line the 1.5 miles, glove over glove, along the top wire. Because, as she said later through chattering teeth once Della had her in against the sheep and chafed the life back into her wrists, she had lain in her bed listening to that wind and known that one woman and a boy could not hold a flock through the night of it, and she was cursed if she'd sit warm by her own stove and let Della Hargrove die being proud. Della did not argue. There was no arguing with Ruth Palmer, and the truth of it was a warm thing in the cold, and she held the wiry old woman a moment longer than the chafing strictly required, and felt Ruth allow it, which from Ruth was a whole speech. The roof went in the black middle of the night. It did not fall all at once, which was the one mercy in it. Della was dozing on her feet against the warm flank of a yew, the way a body learns to steal sleep when it cannot afford to lie down, when she heard above the wind a groan of stressed wood that climbed and climbed, and she was awake and shouting before her mind had named the thing. The northeast corner, where the drift had piled all day and heaped its terrible tonnage of white on the shingles, gave way along the ridge with a crack like a rifle, and a whole section of the roof folded downward into the pen in a roaring collapse of snow and broken shakes and freezing black air. The cold that came through that torn place was a different order of cold, the outer night itself pouring in, the true killing air, and the flock broke. They scattered in a blind gray panic, bleeding, trampling, some bolting straight toward the ruined corner and the open dark beyond it, where the drift had made a ramp up and out into death, and Della understood in one clear, terrible instant that if they scattered into that night, they would all be dead by morning, every one. And Amos's whole life scattered with them under the snow. She did not think. She threw her broad body into the gap, put herself between the flock and the open corner, her arms spread wide inside the great buffalo coat so that she made of herself a wall, a shape larger than a woman. And she roared at them, wordless, using the whole deep register of her chest, the sound a mother animal makes. And she felt the first bodies strike her, and did not give way. Ned was beside her half a breath later, thrown into the breach the same, his gangly arms flung wide, and Ruth on the other flank, with her sharp voice cutting through the dark. And the three of them held that line of open night with their own living bodies while the storm poured through the wound in the roof and tried to take everything. And then Bess. Afterward, Della would never be able to say it in a way that anyone who had not been there would believe, and she stopped trying. But she saw it. In the worst of it, with the flock milling and screaming and the cold reaching in to kill, the old ewe with the torn ear turned away from the open dark toward the lee wall, the south wall the drift had sheltered, instead of crushed. And she lifted that ragged voice in the particular call the matriarch uses to say follow, and she went. She simply went, rolling on her old legs through the panicked press, and the ewes nearest her, the ones who had followed Bess to water and to grass 10,000 times, peeled off from their blind terror and went after her out of pure long habit, and the ones behind followed those. And the panic that had been pulling the flock toward the killing corner reversed itself in the space of a dozen heartbeats and became a gray river of them pouring the other way, toward the wall, toward the warmth of one another, toward the old torn-eared knowledge that had kept this flock alive through more winters than Della had owned it. The wall, Della gasped, understanding, and to Ned and Ruth, get them to the wall, get them packed to the wall, and they left the open corner, which no longer needed guarding, and worked around the edges of the moving mass, pressing it, folding it, packing the animals in against that sheltered south wall in a deep, tight drift of their own warm bodies. Lambs and mothers and yearlings crushed together, breathing as one, and Bess in the heart of it like a stone in the center of a fruit. There was a wagon sheet in the corner, frozen stiff as a barn door, and Della and Ned wrestled it up over the worst of the torn place, not to close it, but to break the direct pour of the wind, lashing it to a standing rafter with cold, clumsy fingers that could not feel the rope, and it bellied and cracked like a thing alive, but it held, and the killing draught became merely a terrible cold, and a terrible cold they could survive. Then there was nothing left to do but the last thing, the oldest thing, the thing that has no cleverness in it at all, to get down among the animals and give them the heat of their own bodies to have back. Della lowered her broad frame into the packed mass against the lee wall, and Ned pressed in one side and Ruth the other, and the sheep closed over and around the three of them, and they lay in the reeking living dark, with the storm screaming a foot above their heads, and gave each other what warmth they had. Old Bess had wedged herself in close against Della's chest, her torn ear against Della's jaw, and Della could feel the old heart going, quick and steady and unafraid. And she pressed her cold face into that greasy wool that smelled of lanolin and dung and life, and held the flock together by the simple animal fact of not letting go, hour on hour, while the season did its worst above them. She did not sleep, and she did not fully wake. She passed the black hours in a country between the two, where Amos came and sat near her the way he used to sit mending harness by the fire, not speaking, only there, and she told him without words that she had them, that she was holding them, that she had not sold them for pennies to Silas Kroll and his silver watch chain and his smirk. Twice in the night a body near her went still and did not start again, and she knew it and grieved it in a distant frozen way and did not let go of the rest, because that was the arithmetic now, the terrible plain arithmetic of a killing winter, that you hold what you can and count the cost when the light comes and not before. When the light did come, it came grudging and gray and in a silence so sudden and total that it woke her more surely than any noise. The wind had stopped, not eased, stopped, all at once, the way it does when a storm has finally spent the whole of itself, and into that ringing quiet the first thin daylight fell through the torn roof and the bellied wagon sheet. And Della lifted her stiff head out of the wool and looked, in dread, to count. They had lost some. She made herself go to each still shape and be sure, and there were 4 of them. 3 yearling ewes and a lamb that had never been strong, cold and gone beneath the drift of the living, and she knelt by each in turn and put her chapped hand on the frozen wool and said she was sorry, plainly, out loud, because they had trusted her and she had not been able to hold every one, and Amos had taught her long ago that you owe the dead ones that much at least. 4. In a night that by every right should have taken 40, around her the rest of the flock was stirring, shaking off the packed snow, the ewes rising on their folded legs and stamping and complaining in the ordinary aggrieved voices of animals who have decided the emergency is over, and old Bess was already up and shouldering her way toward the place where the water ought to be, torn ear-flicking. As though nothing in particular had happened in the night, as though she had not just carried the whole of the Hargrove future out of the dark on the strength of one old habit and one unafraid heart. Ned crawled up out of the wool-white-faced and hollow-eyed and looked at the 4 still shapes, and then at the great living crowd of the rest, and Della watched him understand what they had done, and his cracked lips moved, and no sound came, and she reached over and gripped the back of his neck the way Amos used to grip hers, once hard, which said everything. It was Ruth who broke the frozen quiet, squinting out through the gap in the wagon sheet at the blinding white ruin of the world, the drifts humped to the eaves, the fence lines gone, the sun coming up pale and pitiless over a country turned to bone. Then she made a low sound in her throat that was almost a laugh and almost not, and she said, without turning, that if this had come down so hard on a flock in a sheltered shed with 3 fools to nurse it, then God alone knew what it had done to a couple thousand head of Silas Kroll's fine cattle standing out on the open range with nothing over them but the sky. And Della, kneeling in the wreckage of the barn with the dead under her hand and the living breathing all around her, looked toward the far white nothing where the Kroll range began, and said nothing at all. And out beyond the drifts, the first black specks of ravens were already gathering, sliding down out of the clearing sky toward something on the open ground that would not be getting up. The wind had screamed for 4 days without pause, and then, in the gray hour before a 5th dawn, it simply stopped. Della lay under every quilt she owned and listened to the silence the way a person listens for a heartbeat, half afraid there would be none. The stove had burned to a red eye. Her breath hung visible above her face. She had not undressed in a week. She had slept in her boots and her husband's coat, rising every few hours to break the ice on the water bucket and press her ear against the plank door and hear, past it, the shifting and coughing of the animals. Now the wind was gone, and the quiet pressed down on the cabin like a hand, and she could not tell whether it was the quiet of a thing survived or the quiet of a thing ended. She got up. She had grown gaunt in the long weeks of the storm, her face fallen in under the cheekbones, her wrists gone thin inside the coat sleeves, for she had been feeding the flock her own share more often than she would ever admit to Ruth. She wrapped the faded blue kerchief tighter, worked her split fingers into the frozen mittens, and set her shoulder to the door. It would not give. The snow had drifted against it in the night, packed hard as mortar, and for one bad moment she stood heaving against the planks and thinking she would die shut inside her own house within arm's reach of the flock she had killed herself to save. Then she took the shovel by the jamb, chopped a gap at the top where the drift had not sealed, and dug her way out into a world made new and blinding and terribly still. The sun was coming up over a country she did not recognize. The whole valley lay drowned in white, the fences gone, the creek gone, the road gone, the low hills smoothed into long, pale swells like the sea after a storm. Nothing moved. The cold was a clean, murdering cold, so sharp it hurt the back of her throat, and the light off the snow was so fierce she had to squint and shade her eyes. Then she turned to the lean-to, and her heart went up into her mouth, because the long shed was half buried and silent, and she could not hear a single living thing inside. "Bess," she called, and her voice came out cracked and small in the enormous quiet. Bess. She dug at the drift banked against the shed door with a strength she had no business having, snow flying off the blade, her breath tearing, and she was weeping without knowing it, the tears freezing at once in the creases of her face. She got the door loose and hauled it back against the packed snow, and out of the dark warm reek of the shed, that blessed animal stink of wool and dung and breath she had been afraid she would never smell again, came a low, aggrieved, familiar sound, the old lead-ewe complaining, and then Bess herself shoved her torn-eared head against Della's knee and near knocked her flat. Della went down on her knees in the snow and put both arms around the old ewe's neck and pressed her face into the greasy wool and stayed there a while, and no one was there to see her, which was as she would have wanted it. They were alive. Not all of them. There were 3 more of the weakest gone down in the last night despite everything. And 1 more she would have to put down before noon. But the flock she had culled and doctored and fed with her own hands through the black heart of the winter, the flock the whole town had told her to sell for pennies, stood there in the steaming dark blinking at the light and pushing toward her for the hay they knew she carried. She counted them twice, and the number stopped her cold with a joy so large it frightened her. She had brought them through, nearly all of them, through the worst winter the old-timers could remember. And there was more. She had not let herself think about it in the depth of the storm, but she felt it now under her hands as she moved along their crowded backs, and it made her stop and stand very still. The wool. Their fleeces had grown out long and deep and close in the confinement and the constant careful feeding, longer than any fleece she had ever run her fingers into, and because she had kept them dry and fed them steady, so the fiber grew even and unbroken with no starvation break to weaken the staple. Because of all of that, the wool on these gaunt, scorned, half-wild sheep had come in dense and clean and sound as anything she had ever seen come off a blooded flock back east. She buried her fingers to the second knuckle in Bess's shoulder and could not feel skin. She parted the fleece and looked down into the creamy, unbroken depth of it, and she thought of Amos standing in the yard 3 winters gone, when the town men laughed at him for the money he'd paid for scrub ewes nobody wanted, and how he had only smiled that slow smile, and said, quiet, that a sheep didn't know it was supposed to be worthless, that all a sheep knew was whether it was fed and dry and let alone to grow its coat, and that a man who understood that could make wool where other men made excuses. He had died before he could prove it. He had died with the whole valley calling his flock his greatest folly and calling her the fool who'd married him. And here, under her frozen hand. In the reeking dark of a shed she'd built herself was the proof of him, growing quiet and unremarked on the backs of sheep that were supposed to be dead. Her eyes stung. "You were right," she said aloud to a man 3 months in the ground. "You were right, and I'm going to make them see it." The valley did not know yet. It was still digging itself out. Word came slow across that broken country, carried on the first sleighs that could break a trail, and the word was bad. Bad for everyone but her. The cattle had died in windrows. That was the phrase the men used, standing gaunt and gray faced at the stove in the town store, saying it over and over as if the saying could make it smaller. In windrows, the great herds that had wintered out on the open range, supposed to rustle their own feed and take the weather as cattle always had drifted before the storm until they piled against the fence lines and the coulee walls and frozen standing. Thousands across the whole territory, so that when the snow began to melt the carcasses came out of the drifts in long dark rows, like something out of a bad dream. Men who had been rich in November were ruined in March. Men who had laughed at a woman for keeping sheep in a shed like children stood in the store and did the arithmetic of their own destruction and had nothing left to laugh with. Ruth Palmer was the first to reach her, breaking her own trail on snowshoes with a sack of cornmeal on her back because she'd guessed, rightly, that Della had fed hers to the flock. She came over the last swell of snow and looked at the shed, at the trampled yard, at the sheep pawing at the drifts in the sun, at Della herself standing thin and upright among them, and the sharp-tongued old woman, who was never without something to say, did not say anything at all for a long moment. Then she came down the slope and gripped Della hard by both arms. "You're skin and bone. I'm all right. You are not all right, you great stubborn fool. You fed yourself to those sheep." Ruth's braids were stiff with frost and her eyes were wet, and she was scolding because scolding was the only way she knew to say the other thing. "Half this valley is burying its stock and its hopes together, and you—" She turned and looked at the flock again, at their long, clean coats catching the light, and something moved over her weathered face. "Della, Della, look at the wool on them." "I know it," Della said quietly. "No, girl, I don't think you do. I've run sheep on this ground 20 years, and I have never." Ruth sank her hand into the nearest ewe's fleece and pulled it out and stared at her own fingers as though they'd touched something holy. "What did you feed them?" "What I had." "And then what I didn't have." Della almost smiled. "And I kept them dry." That was the whole of it, Ruth. Amos always said it. Dry and fed and let alone to grow. "Amos," Ruth said, and shook her head, and let out a breath that hung white on the air. "Well, Amos is going to have the last laugh on the lot of them, and it'll come out of your 2 hands. You've done a thing here this valley is going to be chewing on for 20 years. Della did know it, had known it the moment her fingers failed to find skin under the wool. But knowing a thing in the cold privacy of your own shed and having the valley know it were 2 different animals, and she understood, standing there in the blinding sun, that the second would not be simple. Men who have been proven fools do not thank the one who proved them, and there was one man in particular who would not thank her at all. He came 4 days later, when the trails had opened enough for a good horse, in a cutter behind a matched team with sleigh bells on the harness, as though he were paying a social call, and Della knew who it was before she could make out his face, because no one else in that ruined valley would have had the gall to hang bells on his horses in a season of dead cattle. Silas Kroll drew up in her yard, tall and clean-shaven and smiling his permanent smile, and he looked at her flock the way a starving man looks at bread through a window, with a hunger he was too proud to name. "Mrs. Hargrove," he touched his hat brim. "You're looking." His eyes went over her thin face and did her the discourtesy of finishing the sentence honestly. "You're looking like the winter used you hard. It used everybody hard, Mr. Kroll. She did not go to him." She stood by the shed with Ned Farrow a few steps behind her, the freckled boy holding a pitchfork he had not quite decided what to do with, and let Kroll come to her across the trampled snow. "I hear it used your herd harder than most." The smile tightened at one corner. "There'll be losses across the territory. Every outfit worth the name took losses. It's the nature of the range." He waved a gloved hand at it, dismissing his own ruin as though it were weather that had happened to someone else. Then his eye came back to the sheep, to their deep, bright fleeces, and the hunger got the better of the smile. "But you, look at you, kept the whole flock in a barn like lapdogs, and here they stand fat as summer. I'll say this, ma'am, it's a soft way to ranch, but it seems it kept them breathing." He said soft the way another man might say cheating. "Now, let's you and I talk business, before the melt. I'll take the grass off your hands, the water rights with it, and the flock too, if you like, a fair figure. A good deal fairer than a widow alone is going to see from anybody else, and you can go back east and sleep in a warm house and never break ice on a bucket again." "The flock's not for sale," Della said, "nor the grass, nor the water." Something crossed his face then, quick and ugly, before the smile came back down over it like a lid over a pot. "You'll want to think on that. I've thought on it all winter, Mr. Kroll, alone in that cabin while you were warm in town. My answer's the same one my husband would have given you." She lifted her chin. No. He looked at her a long moment. Then he looked, slow and deliberate, past her, up the slope to where the creek came down out of the high ground and crossed the corner of her land before it ran on down to water half the valley below, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he means to own, and he let her see him look, and that was worse than any word. "That's Kroll water up there before it's Hargrove water," he said mildly. "Comes down off my sections. A man could put a dam across it up on his own ground and keep his own water for his own use, and it would be a hard thing to argue him out of it in any court in this territory. Hard thing for a flock to argue with, too, come August, when the grass burns brown and there's not a drop coming down this draw." He smiled, gentle as a preacher. "I'd hate to see it come to that. But a man's got a right to his own water on his own land. Everybody knows that. You'd dry out half the homesteads below me to spite one widow," Ruth said from behind Della. She had come out of the cabin and stood in the door with her arms folded, and her voice could have cut harness leather. "I'd exercise my rights, Mrs. Palmer," Kroll said, unbothered, "and I'd note that most of those homesteads below owe money at the same bank I do considerable business with, and that a bank in a hard year gets nervous about who it's carrying." He gathered his reins, still smiling. "It's going to be a lean spring, ladies, notes coming due all up and down this valley. I'd hate for a woman who worked so hard to lose the ground out from under her for the want of a little cash money in March. You think on my offer, Mrs. Hargrove, the figure won't be so kind twice." He turned the team, and the bells jingled bright and obscene across the field of dead men's ruin, and he drove off the way he'd come, and Della stood watching the cutter grow small against the white until Ned spoke at her shoulder, low and shaking. "He can't really do that, can he, ma'am? Dam the creek? Turn the bank on you?" "He can try," Della said. She was still looking up the slope at the creek, at the corner of high ground where a dam would sit, and she was doing sums in her head that had nothing to do with wool and everything to do with the note Amos had signed at the bank in a better year. The note that came due in the spring. The note she had let herself forget in the long fight to keep the flock alive. A man like that, Ned, he doesn't win by being right. He wins by making it cost you more than you can pay before you can prove him wrong. Then what do we do? She thought of the shed full of long, clean fleece, growing heavier by the week toward the shearing that was still 6 or 7 weeks off, the only answer she had to a rich man's threats. If she could only hold on long enough to get it off their backs and to a buyer before the note came due and the water ran dry. It was going to be close. "We hold on," Della said. She turned from the creek and looked at the boy, at Ruth in the doorway, at Bess nosing at the drift, and squared her aching shoulders under the dead man's coat. "We hold on, and we get to shearing, and we don't sell one animal, nor one acre, nor one drop to that man for any price. Now come on. Those ewes want feeding, and I want to look at that dam site before the light goes." And she took up the shovel and started up the long, white slope toward the creek, her breath smoking, her rolling gait steady over the broken snow, while behind her the flock that was supposed to be dead lifted their heads and watched her go. The wind that came off the mountains in that last week of March carried something new, not the wet iron smell of more snow, but a softening that made the icicles along the barn eaves weep in the afternoon and freeze again hard as glass by dark. Della felt it in the way the crust of the drifts went granular and blue under her boots instead of squeaking dry in the black patches of earth that opened first on the south slope. The creek, which had run silent under a foot of ice since November, began at night to talk again, a low, knuckling gurgle that grew day by day into a proper voice. And the ewes knew it too. They had come through the worst of it gaunt but not broken, their bellies swung low and heavy now, and in the last stretch of the pregnancy Della had fed them like she was feeding kings, the good hay she had hoarded in the loft, the sprouted grain she coaxed along in flat pans by the stove, a little of the linseed cake Doc Vance had bartered her for. She watched their condition the way a banker watches a ledger, running her chapped hand down each spine, feeling for the firmness that told her the lamb inside was making bone and not stealing it from the mother. Bess was the biggest of them all, so wide through the middle that she walked splay-legged and indignant, and Della laughed out loud the first warm morning to see her waddle to the trough like an overloaded freight wagon. Lambing began on the 2nd of April, in the small hours, the way it always did, as if the ewes had conspired to drop their young at the coldest, darkest, most inconvenient turn of the clock. Ned found the first one when he went out to break the ice on the water at 4 a.m. and came pounding back across the yard, hollering for Della with his coat half on and his freckled face split wide with the news. She was already up. She had been sleeping in her clothes for a week. One ear cocked toward the lambing shed she and Ned had cobbled from the old smokehouse, banked round with straw and manure to hold the heat, and she went out into the raw dark with a lantern and her doctoring satchel and did not come back inside, except for coffee, for 4 days. It was a strong crop. That was the thing she had not let herself hope for through all the black months, that the care would show not just in survival, but in strength. But it showed. It showed in the lambs that came sliding into the straw, already fighting to stand, thick-legged and loud, butting for the udder, within the quarter hour. It showed in the ewes that had milk enough and to spare, let down rich and yellow because their bodies had gone into winter with condition on them instead of being scraped to the bone. Amos had told her that years ago a ewe fed right in the fall lambs easy in the spring, and a ewe starved in the fall gives you a dead lamb and a dead mother and a long walk to the boneyard. She believed him now, on her knees in the straw with a slick new lamb in her lap, rubbing it rough with a burlap sack until it coughed and shook its ears and bleated, that thin, ridiculous first cry that undid her every single time. Not all of it was easy. There was a ewe on the 3rd night that got a lamb turned wrong inside her, a foreleg back, and Della had to grease her arm to the elbow and go in after it in the guttering lantern light, her whole self narrowed down to the feel of it. The small folded body she had to coax and turn without tearing anything, without losing either of them. Ned held the lantern and did not faint, though he went the color of tallow. When the lamb finally came alive, gasping and kicking, the boy let out a breath that was half a sob and said, "I didn't think you could do that." And Della, too tired to be modest, said only, "Neither did most folks." There was one she lost, a tiny early twin, too small, that never took a breath no matter how she rubbed and blew and prayed over it, and she buried it under the melting snow with her jaw set hard, because you did not let the men who were watching from town in their minds ever see you cry over a sheep. But against that one loss there were 40-odd that lived, that within a week were bouncing stiff-legged around the muddy paddock in the thin spring sun in that mad boneless way lambs have, tails whirling. And the flock that had numbered so few and so ragged in the fall had near doubled, and every animal in it was clean-eyed and sound. Ruth Palmer came over on the good road once the mud let her wiry frame perched on her old mule, and stood at the paddock rail a long while, taking it all in. She watched the lambs racing and the ewes grazing the first green shoots pushing up through the ruin of the snow, and watched Bess come stumping over to butt her hand for the crust of bread she always had, and finally said, "Well, I'll be damned, Della." And then, because she was Ruth, half this county said you'd be lucky to come out of the winter with a coat and a pair of boots. You come out with a flock twice the size and every lamb on its feet. I hope to God the price holds, because you have earned it, and it would be a bitter thing to earn it and not get it. That was the whole trouble, said in one breath. The price. Because the wool was coming. Della could feel it thickening on their backs day by day as the weather warmed, and the shearing was maybe 5 weeks off. And the whole future of the homestead, whether she kept the land or lost it, whether Amos's scorned vision died with him or was proved right for the whole territory to see, was going to turn on what she got for that clip. And she knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach, that the safe move, the move any prudent widow would make, was to sell the wool cheap and quick and local. There was a man in Ashcroft, a middleman named Purcell, who bought for the mills, and he came through in the second week of April, smelling of hair oil and doing figures on a little pad. He looked at her lambs and at the fleece he pulled up on the ewes' shoulders, and she watched something flicker behind his eyes that he tried to hide, surprise, and then greed, because he knew this was better than good. He offered her 14 cents a pound, cash on the barrelhead, the day of the shearing, no waiting, no risk. And 14 cents a pound on a clip this size was real money. More than she had seen in one place in 3 years, enough to make the bank payment that fell due the 1st of June and have something left over besides. She very nearly took it, standing there in the mud with the numbers singing in her tired blood like a hymn. Take it, take the sure thing, you have suffered enough, be safe. Purcell saw her wavering and pressed, talking about the risk of holding, the fickleness of the Eastern market. The chance no buyer came through at all, and she was left with a barn full of wool and a note come due and no way to pay it, the land gone to Kroll for a song. He had made a career of frightening tired people into cheap sales. But she thought of Amos, not the sick, dwindling Amos of the last year, but Amos in his prime, leaning on the fence with his pipe, telling her about the Eastern buyers who came out to the territory once a year with real money in their pockets, who knew fine wool and paid double what a mill-hand middleman would because they were selling to the fashion houses and not to the cheapest bidder. Otto Lindqvist was the name Amos had spoken with something like reverence. A Swede, a wool man to the marrow, precise as a jeweler, who could tell you the micron count of a fleece by rolling it between his fingers. Amos had never in his life produced a clip fine enough to interest a man like Lindqvist. He had died still dreaming of the year he might. No, Della heard herself say to Purcell, and was almost as surprised as he was. No, I thank you, but I'll be holding my clip for the Eastern buyer this year. Purcell's oily manner curdled fast. He told her she was a fool, that Lindqvist might not even come this far north this season, that she was gambling her land on a rumor and a dead man's dream, and she stood and took it with her chin up and her heart going like a triff-hammer, because every word he said was a fear she had already lain awake with. But she did not change her answer. He climbed into his buggy and slapped the reins and left her there in the mud with the whole enormous risk settling onto her shoulders. And she went into the barn and put her forehead against Bess's warm, woolly flank and stood a long time, breathing. It did not take long for Silas Kroll to hear of it. Nothing on that ridge stayed private, and a widow turning down cash money for a gamble was too rich a piece of foolishness for the town not to chew on. He came riding up the lane on his tall bay on a bright cold morning near the end of the month, silver watch chain catching the light, that permanent smirk arranged on his clean-shaven face, and he sat his horse and looked down at her the way he always did, like she was a problem that time and hardship would eventually solve in his favor. He had come, he said, out of neighborly concern. He'd heard she'd turned down Purcell's good offer, heard she meant to hold her wool for some Swede who might not come. And he wanted her to know his offer still stood, a fair, generous offer, he called it, for the whole homestead, enough to clear her debts and buy her a small, tidy place in town where a woman her age and her size, he said with that smirk, might live out her days in comfort instead of breaking her back on a hill that had already killed one Hargrove. He said it gently, and all the while his eyes were on her fences and her grass, the good deep grass just greening now that his cattle had wanted for 2 generations. Della let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Kroll, my husband kept this grass out from under your cattle for 20 years, and I mean to keep it out from under them a good while longer. My sheep will be shorn on this place, and my wool will be sold to whoever pays me best for it, and my land is not for sale. Not this year, not next, not ever, and I'd take it kindly if you'd not come up my lane again to ask." She was shaking when she said it, but she said it clear, and she saw the smirk waver for a second before it clamped back down, and she knew she had scored on him, and knew, too, watching his eyes go flat and cold as he touched his hat and turned his horse, that she had made an enemy who would not now content himself with waiting. She was right about that. It came 4 nights later. Ned, who had taken to sleeping in the barn loft through the lambing and stayed there since, woke near midnight to a sound that was not the flock, a rasp and a clink down by the newly built shearing pens, where Della had spent 3 weeks of hard labor with him raising sound rails and a swept board floor for the shearers to work on. The boy crept to the loft window and looked down, and in the thin light of a low-quarter moon he saw 2 men working quiet at the base of the pens with a lantern hooded down to a slit, and one of them had a can, and the sharp reek of coal oil came up to him on the night air, and he understood all at once what they meant to do. Burn the pens the week before the shearing, so there'd be nowhere to shear, so the clip would be delayed or ruined and the note would come due, and the whole gamble would collapse, and no way ever to prove who'd struck the match. Ned did not stop to think, which was maybe the saving of it. He filled his lungs and let out a yell fit to wake the dead, and came down the loft ladder 3 rungs at a time and out into the yard in his nightshirt, banging the old iron triangle Della kept by the barn door, hammering it fit to crack, screaming fire and thieves into the dark. Della was out the house door with Amos's old shotgun before she was rightly awake, her graying hair loose, roaring like something out of Scripture. And this was the part she would remember longest, the part that told her the winter had changed more than her flock. The lights did not stop at her own place. Down the valley, at the Palmer place, a lantern flared and Ruth's voice carried up thin and furious on the night wind, and away on the flat where Doc Vance had made his camp, come up 2 days early for the lambing tail end, the old veterinarian was already moving, an ancient pistol in his fist, shouting that he'd seen the fire glow and was coming on. The 2 men at the pens, caught in a closing ring of noise and light, and roused. Angry neighbors lost their nerve entirely. They flung the can down and bolted for the horses they'd left in the willows, and Doc Vance got off 1 wild shot into the air that put wings on them, and they were gone into the dark toward the Kroll range, having managed no more than to scorch 1 post that Ned smothered with a horse blanket before the flame could take. The pen stood. The clip was safe, and Della stood in the middle of her yard in the ringing quiet after, the shotgun heavy in her hands, and looked round at them all, Ned white and shaking and proud, Ruth stumping up the lane still cursing, Doc Vance breathing hard with his old pistol smoking, the whole scattered community that a season ago had shaken its head at the soft, fat widow and her worthless sheep. Now standing armed in her yard in the middle of the night on her side, she did not have words for it. But she knew that whatever Kroll tried next, she would not be facing it alone, and that the shearing, when it came, was going to come. The shearing crew came up the road in the first true heat of June, 3 lean brown men with their combs and their oilstones and their easy contempt for anybody who worked slower than they did, and Della had the flock penned and the board floor swept and the wool table waiting, and she watched them throw the first ewe. It was Bess, because Della had asked for it to be Bess, the old matriarch first of all, and she saw the head shearer's mouth quirk at the look of the animal, the gray muzzle, the ragged ear, the coarse weathered tips, and she saw him decide, the way they all decided, that this was going to be a day of scrub wool off a dead man's folly. Then she saw it come away. The first fleece rolled off Bess in a single unbroken sheet, the way a good fleece should, the way Amos had always said a fleece ought to peel when the animal beneath it had been fed and doctored and carried through hard weather with a steady hand. The shears opened the wool along her belly and up her flank, and there, where the gray weathered tips gave way, was the thing none of them had expected to see. The staple beneath was long and crimped and bright, a creamy white that had never touched the world, and when the blade parted it fully, the fleece fell open like the pages of a book, and the inside of it shone. For a moment nobody spoke. The whole yard, packed with people who had come to watch a soft woman fail, went quiet as a church. Della did not let her face move, because she had learned that a woman who lets her face move gives men something to take from her. But under the apron her fingers had gone tight, and her heart was going like a hammer against an anvil, because she had run her hands into that wool 100 times through the winter, down at the skin where the truth of a sheep lives, and she had known. She had known for weeks, but knowing it in the dark of a January night, alone, was one thing. Seeing it come off in the June sun with 40 pairs of eyes on it was another. Bess kicked once, indignant, shorn to a pale pink surprised-looking creature half her former size, and trotted off shaking her torn ear, and the fleece lay there on the boards like a fall of clean snow. Ruth Palmer was the first to break the silence. She stepped up beside the fleece, dropped to a crouch with the ease of a much younger woman, and buried her wiry hand in it clear to the wrist. She worked her fingers, testing, the way only somebody who had handled wool her whole life would think to test it. Not the tips. The tips lie, but down in the body of it, where the fiber tells you what it truly is. Then she looked up at Della, and her sharp face had gone strange and soft. "Della," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. "Do you feel that?" "I feel it," Della said quietly. "There is not a fleece like this in 3 counties." Ruth stood, holding a lock of it up to the light between finger and thumb, letting the crimp catch the sun. "There is not a fleece like this on any cattleman's spread from here to the river. Would you look at the length of it? Would you look how it's grown?" She turned, holding it high, her voice gone hard and carrying, meant for everyone in the yard. "That is a winter's care in a woman's hands. That is what that is." And now they came forward, slow at first, the way people come toward a thing they were sure they understood and now cannot make sense of. The neighbors who had ridden over that morning, half hoping, in the mean small way people hope. To see the widow's folly proven, they crowded up to the shearing floor and looked down at the fleece and did not know what to say. Della saw old Hollis Tunney take his hat off, which he had not done at Amos's graveside, and turn a lock of the wool over in his brown hand and shake his head slow. She saw a boy no older than Ned reach out and touch it and pull his hand back like it had burned him. And she saw, at the far edge of the yard, up on the seat of his tall, glossy buggy, where he had parked himself to watch the show, Silas Kroll stop smiling. He was too far off for her to see his eyes, but she saw the smirk go. She saw him lean forward with one gloved hand on the buggy rail and look at that fleece, and then at the pen where the rest of the flock stood, waiting their turn. 40-odd of them, every one carrying the same secret weight of wool, grown in thick through the coldest winter the territory had known in 20 years, grown thick precisely because she had fed them through it. Because a starved sheep grows a poor brittle fleece, and a sheep carried warm and fed on good hay grows wool like this. She saw Kroll do the sum, saw his jaw set, and she thought, with a satisfaction she did not try to smother, "You did not think I could feed them, Silas. You waited all winter for me to come to you and sell for pennies, and I did not come." "Ned," she said, "don't stop. There's 40 more." They sheared through the morning and into the long, bright middle of the day, and the pile grew. Della had them lay each fleece out separate on the clean boards, skin side down, and skirt it herself. working round the edge with her chapped fingers, pulling away the dungy tags and the stained belly wool and the coarse bridge, so that what was rolled and tied was clean fleece only. It was the part no man in that yard would have bothered with, and the part that made all the difference. Amos had taught her that in the first year of their marriage, a buyer pays for what he can trust. Della, give him one dirty fleece in the sack and he'll price the whole clip like it's dirty. Give him clean, every time, and he'll come to trust your name, and a name he trusts is worth more than the wool. She thought of that, kneeling there, more than once, and her throat went tight, and she skirted the next fleece and did not let it show. By the time the shadows had begun to lean the other way, the whole flock stood shorn and pink and foolish looking in the pen, and the fleeces lay rolled and bound in a great pale mountain under the lean-to, and the yard smelled of lanolin and cut grass. And Ned Pharaoh's arms were shaking with the labor, and his freckled face was split ear to ear with a grin he could not have stopped if he'd wanted to. And that was when the buyer came. They heard the wagon before they saw it, a hired rig from the town livery, and then it rolled into the yard, and a portly man climbed down with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not trust his own feet on strange ground. He was dressed for town and not for a homestead, in a checked suit of brownish wool and a stiff collar, and he had a round, pink, precise face and a pair of steel spectacles, and he carried a black leather satchel and a small brass scale beam wrapped in flannel, the way another man might carry a fiddle. He looked about him with mild, methodical eyes, and when he spoke it was with the careful, rounded vowels of a man who had learned his English second, off a distant, colder shore. "I am looking," he said, for Mrs. Hargrove. "I am Otto Lindqvist. I buy wool. You found her." Della came forward, wiping her hands down her apron, though there was no cleaning them, and put out her red-chapped right hand and shook his soft pink one square, the way Amos would have. "You've had a long ride out, Mr. Lindqvist. There's water at the well and buttermilk in the spring house if you'll take it." "After," said Otto Lindqvist. "Thank you, after." His eyes had already gone past her, to the lean-to, to the pale mountain of rolled fleece stacked clean under the shade. Something changed in his round face. He did not smile. She would learn that he almost never smiled, but his mild eyes sharpened behind the steel spectacles, and he set his satchel down with great care, and said, more to himself than to her so, "This is the clip they told me not to trouble myself to come and see." Della felt something go still and cold and attentive inside her. "Who told you that?" "A gentleman in town. A cattle gentleman. Tall, a silver chain here." He touched his own round waistcoat where a watch chain would sit, and glanced at her sideways, shrewd. He was most kind. "He told me the widow Hargrove's wool would be scrub wool, off-scrub sheep, not worth the freight to the railhead, and that I should look instead at his own clip, which he would sell me cheap as a favor." Lindqvist lifted the nearest bound fleece, hefted it, and went very quiet. "He was most kind," he said again, softly, "to try to save me the trip." And then, for a long while, Otto Lindqvist did not talk at all. He worked. He untied the fleece and threw it open on the boards, skin down, and went over it the way Ruth had, but slower, and colder, and more terribly thorough, a man reading a ledger he suspected of lies and finding, line by line, only truth. He pulled a lock from the shoulder and stretched it between his hands and set his ear near it, and Della heard the small dry sound the crimp made, the sound of sound fiber that does not part. He measured the length of the staple against the knuckles of his hand, and his pink eyebrows went up, and he measured it again, as if he did not believe the first reading. He dug down to the skin end, and found it sound, not tender, not broken by starvation into a weak place that would snap in the mill, the fault line where an underfed sheep's wool gives way. There was no fault line. She had seen to that with every forkful of hay she had carried out into the screaming dark from November to April. He opened a second fleece, then a third, from the bottom of the stack, to be sure she had not stacked her best on top to fool him. He weighed one on the little brass beam and read off the figure under his breath in his own language, a low, astonished string of foreign words. He weighed another. He stood a moment doing arithmetic behind his spectacles, and the whole yard watched him do it, 40 people gone silent again. And Silas Kroll's glossy buggy had not moved from the far fence, and Silas Kroll was not smirking now. At last Otto Lindqvist straightened up. He took the steel spectacles off and polished them, slow, on a clean handkerchief, set them back on, and turned to Della where she stood with her hands folded under her apron, and looked at her as though he were seeing her properly for the first time. Not the soft, heavy widow the town had described to him, but whatever it was he saw now. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I have bought wool in this territory 9 years, and in Ohio before that, and in the old country before that from boyhood at my father's knee. My father graded fleece for 40 years. He set his plump hand flat and reverent on the open fleece beside him, the way a man lays his hand on a Bible. This is the finest, the cleanest, the soundest clip I have handled in this territory. Not the best of the widow's wool, not the best of the poor man's wool. The best, long in the staple, fine in the fiber, strong to the skin, and skirted like I have not seen a clip skirted since I left the East. There is not a burr in it, not a dungy lock in the sacks. Somebody has gone over every fleece on her knees." His mild eyes flicked to her red-chapped hands and back to her face. "I think I am looking at her." Somewhere in the crowd a woman drew a sharp breath. Ned Farrow made a sound half a laugh and half something else and clapped his hand over his mouth. "I will not insult you," Otto Lindqvist went on, "with the price I was told to expect to pay. I came here to buy scrub wool cheap. I find instead that I must go home and tell my buyers in Boston that I have secured, from a homestead they have never heard of, in the name of a woman none of them know, the premium clip of the season." He reached into his black satchel and drew out a small cloth-bound book and a stub of pencil, licked the pencil, and named a figure. He named it plainly, in dollars and cents, per pound, and then, because the per pound meant nothing until it met the weight, and he had the weight now, he did the multiplication out loud, slow, so that every soul in that yard could follow the sum, and he spoke the total. The number landed in the yard like a stone dropped in a still pond. It was more than Amos Hargrove had cleared in the best 3 years of his life, laid end to end. It was more, Della understood, standing very still with her hands locked under her apron so no one would see them shake, than enough to clear the note on the homestead, the note Silas Kroll had bought up quiet through the bank that spring. So certain it would bring her crawling to his door by first snowfall with a bill of sale for the grass already signed. It was enough to pay it entire, in one payment, and have money over. It was enough to break his hand off her throat clean at the wrist. She heard, from the direction of the far fence, the creak of a man shifting his weight on a buggy seat. She did not turn to look. She would not give him that. But she let herself think it, with her dead husband's voice going through her like a warm current. "A name he trusts is worth more than the wool. Della, give him clean, every time." "Mr. Lindqvist," she said, and was pleased to hear her own voice come out steady and low. "You'll take that buttermilk now, and then you and I will sit down at my table, and we will write it all down proper, and you will put your name to it, and I'll put mine." She drew a breath. "And there's a man over yonder by my fence holds a paper of mine at the bank. I believe, once your business and mine is done, that I'll be able to go into town Monday morning and settle with him in full." She had ridden into Miles City with Otto Lindqvist's draft folded flat against her breastbone under her good dress, and laid it on the banker's counter, and watched the man count out against the ledger that had Amos's name in it, and his father's before him, and then draw the line through the debt with a pen that scratched like a small, triumphant insect. He had called her Mrs. Hargrove, and there had been no pity in it, and no doubt either, only the flat respect a bank keeps for money that comes when it is owed. She had walked out with the paper that said the homestead was hers, clear and whole, and stood a moment in the sun, and she had not wept. She had done all her weeping in the barn in February with her arms buried to the shoulder in a laboring ewe. What she felt instead was something wide and quiet, like the moment after a hard-swung axe finally splits the round and the two halves fall away clean. But paying the note was only the closing of one book. Della had a great many pages left to fill, and she had been raised by a mother who taught her that money in the hand was a live coal. It warmed you or it burned the house down, depending on how fast you set it to work. So the water rights came first, before the ram, before anything. A homestead in that country was worth precisely as much as its claim to the creek, and no more, and the men who had spent a season sizing up her grass had been sizing up her water twice as hard. There was a stretch of the rosebud fork that ran the length of her lower section, and the filing on it had always been loose, half-finished, the kind of thing Amos meant to tighten and never did, because tightening things had bored him, and sheep had not. Della rode to the land office herself. She read every line before she signed, moving her chapped finger under the words the way Amos had taught her, and where the language was slippery, she made the clerk say it back in plain speech until it held still. When she left, the water that crossed her land was hers by law, decreed and dated, and no cattle outfit in the territory could dig a ditch upstream of her and call it progress. Ruth Palmer said it best, standing in Della's kitchen with a cup of coffee cooling in her wiry hand. You bought the creek before you bought the sheep. Amos would have done it backwards and been proud of himself. You did it right, and won't say a word. And she gave that short bark of a laugh that was the closest Ruth came to open affection, and Della smiled down into her own cup and let it stand as the compliment it was. The ram, when it came from a Rambouillet man near the Yellowstone, whose stock Amos had talked about for years the way other men talked about horses. Della drove 2 days to see him, with Ned on the seat beside her holding the lines when her hands tired, the boy grown half a head taller in a single year. The rancher walked them out to a pen where a great pale ram stood square on the earth as though he had been set there to hold it down. He was deep through the chest and dense in the fleece, and when Della sank her fingers into the wool at his shoulder, she felt the crimp of it clear to the skin, close and springing and fine, the very thing Amos had chased across a decade of thin years and never quite caught. "He'll throw you lambs that shame their mothers," the rancher said. "If you can feed him." "I can feed him," Della said, and did not elaborate, because a winter she had already survived was the only argument that mattered, and this man had not been there to see it. She paid the price whole, because she had learned that a fair price paid whole made a man remember you kindly, and a homestead lives or dies on who remembers it kindly. Ned rode in the wagon bed with one hand on the beast's neck the whole 2 days home, talking to it low and steady the way he'd learned to talk to the flock in the storm, and when they came up over the last rise and the valley opened green below them, the boy went silent and just looked, the way a person looks at a thing he has helped to save. The ram had a name by nightfall. Ned called him Amos, and then went red to the ears and started to take it back, and Della said, "No, leave it." He'd have liked being a ram better than being a man, most days, and Ned laughed, relieved, and the name stuck, and that was how the flock got its second Amos, a broad pale king of a sheep who would, over the next 3 springs, remake every fleece on the place in his own fine image. It was that same green season that Silas Kroll came up the wagon road the last time. Della saw him from the garden, where she was on her knees thinning carrots with the earth warm under her palms, and she knew him a quarter-mile off by the silver watch chain catching sun and the clean-shaven set of his head. She did not rise. She waited until his horse had stopped at the gate and stood a moment more before she got to her feet, slow and rolling in her steady gait, and wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the fence to meet him. The smirk was gone. That was the first thing she marked. Kroll had worn that permanent half-smile at Amos's funeral, and through every offer since, thinner and thinner as the winter did its killing work, and now, with the whole territory talking about the Hargrove clip and the record it had fetched. The smirk had finally been shaved off him along with, she guessed, a good many head of cattle. His outfit had come through the year lighter than it went in, and the difference between his herd and her flock was the difference between a man who had scorned the weather and a woman who had knelt in it. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, and touched his hat, and she noted that too. The hat, the courtesy, the small deference of a man who has recalculated. "Mr. Kroll." He looked out over her lower section, the good grass rolling down to the willow line and the creek she now owned outright. "I'll come to it plain," he said. "I misjudged the place. And I'll own I misjudged you. There's no shame in a man revising his figures when the market talks." He named a number then. It was a great deal of money. It was more than triple what he had offered her over Amos's fresh grave, when he had stood there in his good coat and told her, gently, as though it were a kindness, that a woman of her build and her softness had no business trying to hold ground that hard. She remembered the exact temperature of the shame that had gone through her that day. She found, standing at the fence now, that she could hold the memory up to the light and turn it and feel nothing but a distant, weather-worn interest, the way you look at a scar from a burn that healed clean years ago. "That's a fair offer," she told him, and meant it. Something eased in his face. He thought he had her. She watched him think it, and she was not unkind about what came next, because she had no more use for cruelty than for waste. "It's a fair offer, and I thank you for making it honest, which is more than the last one was. But I'm not selling, Mr. Kroll, not this year, not next, not for that money, nor twice it." She looked past him, down the slope, to where old Bess stood grazing at the edge of the near flock, with the pale ram moving big and slow among the ewes. "My husband is buried on that rise under the cottonwoods, and my sheep are the finest in the territory, and the creek is mine by decree. There's nothing you have that I want, and I've made my peace with everything I've got. I say that without any hardness. I just don't have a price." Kroll was quiet a moment. Then he did a thing she had not expected. He laughed, a real laugh, short and rueful, a man conceding a hand fairly lost. "Amos always said you were the smart one," he told her. "I thought that was just a man being fond." He touched his hat again. "If you ever want to talk stock breeding, Mrs. Hargrove, I've a mind to run some sheep myself now. Seems the ground's been trying to tell us something out here for a while, and it took a widow to hear it. Come by in the fall," she said. "I'll tell you what I know. It'll cost you a day's fence mending, same as anybody." And that was Silas Kroll, turned from a wolf at the gate into a neighbor who owed her a day's labor, riding back down the wagon road with his silver chain flashing. A little smaller than he'd come, and easier in himself for it. The valley came to her after that the way water finds the low ground, slowly, and then all at once. And then as though it had always run that way. A rancher's wife sent her boy over to ask how Della had kept her lambs off the scours through the wet spring, and Della sent him home with a jar of the drench she made and a paper of directions in her square hand. A young couple homesteading up the North Fork lost their whole notion of what they were doing halfway through their first lambing and came to her in a panic, and she went, and stayed 2 nights, and did not let a single ewe die, and would take nothing for it but a promise that they'd pass the same on when their turn came. Men who had laughed a year before about the soft widow and her scrub flock now took their hats off when she came into the mercantile, and asked, careful and sidelong, whether it was too early to shear, and where a body might find a ram like the one she'd brought up from the Yellowstone. She answered them all. She had come up the hard way, alone in a killing season, and she saw no profit in making anyone else climb it blind. But she noticed that the same voices which had called her too soft to last now called her, when they named her at all, simply the best sheep hand in the valley, which was the plain truth, and had been all along, waiting only for a winter hard enough to prove it. Doc Emery Vance came through in the late summer on his rounds, and Della fed him at her table the way she had every season since Amos died. He had been the one to tell her, that first grief struck autumn, that a scrub flock could be built up, if a body had the patience and the eye, and that most bodies had neither, and that he suspected she might have both. He looked around her kitchen now, at the full shelves, the good ham hanging, Ned's boots by the door, and Ruth's shawl over the chair back, and said, "You've made a family here, Della. I hope you see that. It doesn't always come to a person the way it came to you, out of a bad winter, but it's a family all the same, and it's a rare one." She had not thought of it in that word before. But it was true. Ned was more son to her now than hired boy, and would inherit a share of the place in time, and worked like a man building his own future because he was. Ruth came and went like a sharp-tongued sister, and would grow old at that table, and the doc himself was folded in among them, the wandering uncle who turned up with the seasons and was always fed. Amos was gone, and the ache of that would never entirely leave her, and she did not want it to. But grief, she had learned, was not a wall you climbed over and left behind. It was a thing you carried, and if you carried it right, it settled into the shape of everything you built afterward, and became a kind of foundation, and held. The last of the light was going gold and long across the pasture when Della climbed the rise to the cottonwoods, alone but for Bess, who came slow and stiff behind her, with her torn ear flicking. The grave was tended. Della kept it so, the mound settled and grassed over now, and the plain headstone Amos would have called foolish and been secretly pleased by, cut with his name and the years and nothing else, because he had never been a man for extra words. In her hand she carried a single lock of wool. She had chosen it that spring at the shearing, out of the whole record clip, the finest and cleanest staple off the best ewe on the place, long and bright and crimped to the tip, so fine you could draw it through a wedding ring. The kind of wool Amos had described to her once in the dark of a lean winter, as though describing a country he was sure existed and would never live to see. She had kept back this one lock from all of it, knowing already where it would go. She knelt at the headstone the way she knelt at everything, slow and sure, and laid the lock of wool on the top of the stone where the last sun could catch it and turn it near to white. "There," she said, quiet, the way she'd talked to him across the pillow once. "There's your country, Amos. It was here the whole time. You just needed somebody stubborn enough to feed it through to spring." Bess pushed her old head against Della's shoulder, and Della put an arm around the ew's neck without looking. The two of them settled there in the last of the day. Below them the flock moved through the good grass toward the fold, pale and heavy and sound. The ewes and their lambs and the great ram among them, and the creek that was hers ran silver at the foot of the slope. And the smoke stood up straight from her own chimney in the still evening air. She stayed until the color went out of the west and the first star stood over the ridge. Then she rose and brushed the earth from her skirt with her chapped red hands and started down toward the lamplight and the full table and the people who were waiting on her, with the old ewe following after, and the lock of wool left behind on the stone to catch whatever light there was, a small bright flag planted on ground that had been won, at last, by the very hands the world had been so certain were too soft to hold it.